Just to reintroduce myself, my name is Judy Kibinge, and I'm the founding director of Docubox, which is East Africa's first film fund, supporting the work of independent documentary films in the region. I'm something else, though. I'm also a mother, and my little boy turns 9 years old next month. And in 10 years, just 10 years, he's going to be 19, something that I can't quite fathom, because perhaps 19 was my favorite year of all time. And it's probably because, at 19 you're young, but you're not too young. You're grown up, but not too grown up. And for me, I felt that I was a teen who still could work. I was old enough to married. I was old enough to buy a drink. I was old enough to get arrested. I was old enough to vote. So it means a lot that in just 10 years, 1 month from today, in 2031, my son, inshallah, is also going to turn 19. And for a moment, he's going to occupy that powerful moment in between childhood and adulthood. But things are changing so incredibly fast, and they'll have changed more than that by then. And our population is exploding faster than we can count, faster than we can create meaningful employment. We've been ravaged, as Wajira said, by COVID. It's hard to see what the implications for not just us, but for our kids and our grandkids will be down the line. And it's, so much as I'm looking forward to my son turning 19, I'm also anxious, because climate experts have been telling us that 10 years is about the time that we have to get our rising greenhouse emissions under control. And so even though the future feels a little hazy, this image of my child, my nieces, my nephews coming of age adds a certain urgency to everything. And I hope just wherever you are, as you listen, close your eyes and try and picture someone who's little that you love in 2031. What will this continent be? What kind of future do we wish for our loved ones? And what can we do now, here, today, to deliver that world with cities well planned, and all these wonderful things that we spoke about just earlier. According to the IPCC, which is a body of 800 scientists who advise the UN on climate change, human activities, as we just talked about, have caused about a degree of global warming above pre-industrial levels. And it's, we hope it doesn't, but it's likely to hit 1.5 in the next 10 years. A degree doesn't really sound like that much, does it? But it is. If we don't manage those emissions, the world in 10 years will be a far more challenging place. We've already, on this continent, experienced massive floods and landslides in western Uganda. We've had locust invasions and floods in Kenya. We've had melted glaciers in the Ruwenzoris. We've had cyclones in Mozambique. We've had droughts and water shortages in South Africa. And here's the ringer. All of Africa, with its enormous landmass and growing population, has contributed in just a tiny percentage, less than 5% to global warming. So maybe all of this preamble is to ask you, to ask all of us, are we really asking the really important questions? Are we really asking ourselves why this is happening? Are we really taking time to tell a story and paint a picture that all of us can rally around, really, truly rally around? And maybe it has something to do with the way we're telling this climate change story. So while over the next two mornings, you're going to hear stories and true stories told directly by African farmers and community leaders and activists, I want to ask for a moment, what stories are we not telling? And what are we not speaking about? And what about those stories? Stories that help us understand the position that we're in better. And so I'm going to tell a story. Yeah, I'm going to tell yet another story. After all, look, this is a story lab. That's what we're going to do for, really the next 2 mornings. We're going to unpack the reality of the moment through story. And I'm going to tell you the story about the life of a family in a village. And please don't roll your eyes just yet, even though a lot of it is going to sound familiar. Just listen to me and really try and imagine this family. In that village, and this was a while back, you've got, boys would plow and they'd work the fields and they'd tend the cattle, and girls would be there spinning, weaving baskets and cloth. And in this village, when a young man's old enough, he'd leave to try and learn a trade. And more often he wouldn't get that opportunity, and he'd have to work as a hired hand doing all these rough jobs, literally earning peanuts to survive. And more often, he'd always be in danger of unemployment in that village. And girls, on the other hand, would leave home, typically work as servants. A girl's life was just hard in that village, filled with abuse, endless work. And women in that village would be married always before the age of 30 and often have, at least six kids. And of those 6 kids, perhaps one in 5 would die in infancy, 1 in 3 in poorer areas, from all kinds of ailments, from dehydration, diarrhea, and so on. And families were always afraid, always thinking, the crops are going to fail. It hasn't rained. So there was a lot of malnutrition and disease. And guess what? There was hardly any iron machinery to make the tools needed to progress. It was just too costly, all this iron machinery. And the dream of industrialization just seemed so far-fetched, it didn't even exist. So does this sound familiar? Does it? Does this sound familiar? It's not Africa I'm talking about, it's Europe, it's America. And that was what Europe and America were in the 18th century. They were exactly what many parts of Africa are today. In this typical European village that I've just described 300 years ago, when the world's population barely scraped 1 billion people, European and American cities as we know them, with their skyscrapers and their coal-fed power plants and their blinding lights and their entertainment parks and entertainment industries and shopping districts and financial districts and super malls and pop stars and traffic jams and huge populations commuting to work and back home and to work and back home. That didn't exist. It was villages, just like the one that I've described and that we all on this continent know so well. So because this story of a pre-industrial Europe is not often told, we in Africa, often we don't really seem to see it or realize that it even existed. And Europe and America in no particular rush to remind us that this is what they were 300 years ago. So how did Europe and America make this magic leap into developed countries? Now, I'm no expert, but I know that the Industrial Revolution first started in Great Britain, progressed to the US. The steam engine was built in 1672, and it powered these huge machines, and it made iron, and the iron improved machines, and the machines built bridges and ships. And so this is when Wajira talks about resilience, building resilience, getting out of poverty. This is what we are talking about. It is not something that we shouldn't be asking for. It is something that we must demand and fight for. The only catch is that this whole industrial revolution raised global temperatures. A study done in Leeds University in 2020 says the richest 10th of people consume 20 times more energy overall than the bottom 10, wherever they live. And so the gulf is greatest in transport, where the top 10th gobble up 187 times more fuel than the poorest 10th. The gap is so wide that emissions are also growing here now. South Africa is Africa's biggest greenhouse gas emitter, and China accounts for 1/4 of the world's emissions, consuming half of the world's coal. Why? Because we too are seeking to catapult ourselves. We deserve it. We need to develop. We must attain resilience. But this comes at a cost. But the world is talking, And thankfully, there are all kinds of agreements. There's a binding legal agreement made at COP21 for wealthier developed countries to financially support developing countries in catching up to climate compliance. And what do we as Africans have that will help us catch up? You know, what is it that we possess right here, right now, wherever we're watching from to help us catch up? It's a piece of real estate. It's about 15 centimeters long. It's right here. And I think all we need to do is to use that real estate that we have right here, our minds, to strategize, to generate fresh ideas, to use these ideas to create viable solutions, effectively communicate these ideas and solutions in a way that resonates and illuminates and changes minds. We've got to tell powerful stories. We've got to tell powerful stories to each other and to our leaders as well. Because a good storytelling strategy can transcend borders. And in this case, you know, Africa is made up of 3,000 different ethnic groups. We speak over 2,000 languages. We live in 54 different countries. But guess what? If there's anything that can transcend all of these different borders, it's a good storytelling strategy. And that's something that I think we're good at. I think we are good at telling stories. If we just take a moment and we think about the movements that have changed or impacted the world, leaders, you know, good or bad, and the part that story played in that change, it all begins to make sense. You know, Hitler told stories that created division. He told those stories over and over again, and he was a great orator, and his hateful speeches were able to unite one race against another and lead to the annihilation of millions of people, over 6 million Jews. And in contrast, you had Barack Obama, first black president in 2008, even though 60% of Americans in 1938 had said they'd never vote for a black president. And what made that change happen? What could have made it happen? It was story. And his story, the story that he told again and again, was a story of hope. And that changed something. It created a movement. This too is our time. You know, and as we've said, it's time to really tackle the climate issues, but not in isolation. How do we create a movement that will change and transform our continent? The stories that we tell here and now going forward, so that my 19-year-old son, like other young Africans, will inherit a future that enables them to thrive and live up to their full potential, begins here. And the Climate Lab is the space and place where we can unite around common goals made possible through the power of story. And so we invite you to join us for the next 2 mornings to delve deeper into some of the stories that will change the present that we have into a really viable future. Thanks so much.